Welcome to We Don't Compete on Security. You are at the Ohio, of course, Linux Foundation conference virtually because this is 2020 after all. And, we are people, so you might hear a dog bark or a door shut because we are at home. For all I know, there could be a house re-roofing right now. I'm Andrew Krug. I'm a security geek at Datadog. And this is my good friend, Nathan. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Nathan?
Hi, I'm Nathan. I am a security geek at AWS.
We thought it'd be fun today to walk you through the topic of open sourcing your security efforts and challenge some of your base assumptions about whether or not there are some things in your work that might be able to move from your current workflow, perhaps out of a basement somewhere, into the open. We're going to talk through the different business reasons that you might just consider doing this crazy thing we like to call open source. And we'll look at examples of some projects that have worked out well and what the attributes of those are. And at the very end of this call, we will have a call to action, which is a way that you can get involved with an open source initiative that the two of us are working on right now. In a nutshell, that means that you should walk away with an idea of how to start that conversation at your business, an understanding of some of the concerns and issues around open source, and be given a link to a little survey right at the end that you can do for some follow-up after the con. We'll have a white paper, a webinar, etc., because we like takeaways. Right, Nathan?
We love takeaways. It's unfortunate that today we're not going to be able to give you as many takeaways as we normally do.
Which brings us to our fair warning that this is a thought leadery talk. And you may or may not like thought leadery talks, and you may love our fun demos that we generally do in our presentations at reInvent. But we want to see your fun demos as a result of this 30-minute presentation. We want to see those out in the world and your fun security tools. If you've never seen us talk before and you're looking for demos, quite possibly the best place to look is some of the old talks that Nathan and I have collaborated on together. We've been geeking out on security stuff since 2016, all over the place, trying to think of new ways to solve interesting and fun problems with a bunch of folks as well. If you look really closely, you can see us there at Reinforce 2019, doing a workshop on an open source SIM. And that was a great workshop. All these are still available out there on the web. But we've launched a lot of tools. We taught a lot of folks along the way. And we've had some great things that came out of those talks. It wasn't just talks we delivered. There have been another number of white papers, tools, and other work that kind of came out of this collab together, all in the name of this thing we call open source security.
I really like the Fargate IR one, frankly, my personal fave. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, Fargate IR was a good talk. DIY guide to run books, playbooks, and incident response. I look back on that fondly when I think of in-person events. So some people might say that as a result of this, I've been heavily open source influenced, but I actually think that's understated. I'm open source infected, and that might be a bit of a charged term in 2020, but I spent 3 years as a Mozillian. I did a tour at the only place I think you can work in the world that is open by default and open by design. And now when I can't do that kind of work, it just really gets at me. And when I see other people missing opportunities to share their work with others, it really gets to me. So I hope by the end of this talk that we can infect you with a little bit of open source in a good way, and you'll be inspired to open source something of your own. So why would you consider building a strategy on open source to run your security program? It's crazy, right? Like generally when we think of security, we think of things that we hide as a means of kind of evading attacks. But, there are advantages to doing this open source thing. But before we can talk about that, we need to think for a minute about the benefits of open sourcing something and the concerns around that, and also challenge the idea that open source is only code, right? So that brings us to this paper, the Mozilla Framework for Purposeful Open Source. It came out in 2018. Mozilla fellow by the name of Patrick Finch did a study to try and categorize the different considerations around different types of open source projects. It was a very cool study. I suggest that you take some time to give it a read if you are going to kick off an open source effort. but we'll kind of give you the bullet points here. Basically, Patrick went and took the time to identify these buckets on screen here as some of the most common among all the projects that he looked at. And he created an index of considerations around the curation of these projects and why an individual or a company would want to even consider open sourcing. In security, we see a lot of variety across these various archetypical models, and the trade-offs are just something that you need to be aware of when you're evaluating the reason that something is open before trying to use it in your security program. So if you look at these, there's things like B2B, wide open, trusted vendor, specialty library, controlled ecosystem, all of these different motivations. And we all know that we're sort of yearning for the wide open, but the real reasons that companies are involved in open source vary greatly. And we don't need to necessarily preach to this community, of course, because this is, after all, a Linux Foundation conference. But let's look at a few of these motivations. Like these three archetypes here, I think are fairly prominent in security software. Mostly because from a business perspective, they're an easy sell in order to get maintainers and community curation. The business to business, of course, we're trying to onboard people to our technology. Controlled ecosystem, something like a Kubernetes, or a specialty library, something that solves a very specific problem in a very specific way that a large community has, like Rust. Rust solves a significant problem, for example, for a very large community. But we still want this wide open archetype. We want this kind of the perfect future, which is the dream, right? We have large scale collaboration, a self-sustaining community, and it scales via users helping users instead of a large corporate structure kind of coming in and curating these projects.
Now, you know, Andrew and I do a lot of incident response. We've talked a lot about incident response in the past. And because of that, when we look at wide open things, sometimes it can get a little awkward for folks, especially in the large enterprises or in large businesses where you have maybe a CISO that isn't necessarily accustomed to looking at an open source project. But specifically when we get into security libraries to wide open, I would urge you to think about the concepts of encryption. And the reality is that when you look at an encryption algorithm, it's really not tested until you've made it open and everybody gets to take a look at it and evaluate whether you made any mistakes. So in this scenario, we're going to talk about some strategies that help you understand where that open source product fits or can fit inside of your strategy, and also why it makes it better.
Yeah, and the assertion would be here that this community really needs more wide open projects in the ecosystem, and not just software. Once again, like we're not just talking about software, we're talking about anything that you can curate that solves a problem, fills a need, and you can build a community around. You can start small. You can start in one of these archetypes and you can move to another. But the point is you need to do a good job engaging with that community in order to kind of leverage this thing that we call open source. And you might be asking why you should do this. Why would you open source a specific tool or framework, etc.? In 2016, I had the pleasure of watching Dan Kaminsky keynote at BlackHat, and he told this story about a bunch of banks sitting down and sharing their security strategies in the open with one another because it was mutually beneficial. The answer is, it is mutually beneficial for you to share your security secrets with other people in your industry, because then you just get to compete on features. You get to build customer confidence in your fellow technology partners and in your industry, and security is a lever to encourage clients to move over to you. And that one statement, it stuck with me over the years, which is, we don't compete on security. And honestly, if you think you don't have anything that you can open source from your security program, I assure you that you do. Even if you don't have an army of security engineers writing code all day long, you can open source all kinds of things: frameworks, runbooks, job family architectures. Heck, you can even open source a doc template, and that's going to bring somebody some value on it. Like, quite honestly, the Mozilla incident response template, I still refer people back to all the time because it's one of the only publicly available IR templates that's out there.
Well, and right now, for instance, I'm actually working on an organizational structure that's going to be open sourced. And so as that organizational structure gets out there and people actually start using it, we intend to increase an organization's security by helping them respond and deal with security in a different way because they're structured a different way. How does that change the way you do your processes? How does that change the way you respond to incidents? How does that change the way you build your runbooks and playbooks? Andrew and I have done a number of talks around building good runbooks and playbooks. But what does that mean specifically to you? And I got news for you. There are still a lot of people out there that don't do that. It would be really helpful for everybody else. If you have a good runbook or playbook, or you think it's really solid and you're really happy with it, open source it. Take a look at it.
And this, at the end of the day, it's an acknowledgement that we all have a common set of problems to solve, right? Like regardless of your size or scale, if you're a new startup company that's just walking in today, like you just get started, you're going to have the same problems as a startup 2 years ago, plus a few others, but everybody's starting from scratch, right? Like how many times we made a cloud security organization chart or created a cloud security roadmap for a brand new piece of software from scratch, like totally from scratch. How many times have those very, very similar words been written down?
Or a chat client.
Or a messaging service, yeah, messaging services. And that's a great segue into our next point, which is that there is one more, slightly more dangerous archetype, right? And that is this one that my good friend Patrick Finch likes to call the bathwater open source archetype from that 2018 study. And it's the idea that you just dump something on GitHub just to distribute it, and then you never check back in on it. You don't curate the issues, you don't respond to people, you never improve it. Well, we had a phrase for that before it was called open source. It was just called publishing. And publishing has a value, don't get me wrong, but the value of open source is in the evolution of your contribution, not specifically the act of publishing all by itself. So Nathan, as a security expert, how do we start building an awesome security program using open source? What do you think are some of the key pieces and parts we might consider if I were, say, a CISO kicking off a new program at a new startup or an existing company, more terrifyingly? And let's say that company is running cloud in 2020, which I would think would be an advantage, right? Because we can do things so much faster with cloud.
So I would tell you that I think that it is and it isn't. When we look at security strategies in general, the one thing that I, as the advisor, when I walk in and talk to a CISO, don't want to see is a product list. The goal for a strategy isn't to have a list of open source projects that you're going to contribute to or work on. That's great. Don't get me wrong. I'm happy that you're doing that. We are all happy that you're doing that. The intent is, though, that you get something out of it. So when we look at things, we want to make sure that you have both things that we can quantify, things that will actually add up, that you can say, hey, look, we've made this many changes to the code and it's gotten this much better, or we have this many features we wanted to implement and they've gotten better. When we talk about risk compliance and governance, near and dear to my heart as an incident responder, how many of those governance policies have you actually open sourced? Have you open sourced any of those things? And could those policies actually then incorporate into another open source project and make that project better? Now, as we look at your strategy, right, you're going to say something like, I would very much like to have all of my compliance checked on a daily basis and evaluate whether or not my governance standards have been followed all year long. And I want to be able to know that when something happens, it will be remediated. And that's a great statement. I'm really happy with that action statement. That makes me feel good. I know there's a business case behind it. Not going to get into building business cases. Obviously, everything ends in money. But the reality here is that we have to make the world a better place. So one of the things we also need to think about as we contribute to an open source project is, how are we training our people? What kind of things do we get out of that? What are the things that are maybe non-quantifiable or non-tactile? Well, the nice part about open source is we have a lot of code. We have a lot of things that people need to write and change and do. So now we have the things like governance and strategy. We have feature sets. We have things that you need specifically to do, user stories, business cases. Then we have your team actually working on the training and the awareness of those pieces. So it's kind of a holistic thing. And here's the great part. When my company does that and Andrew's company does that, the world gets to be a better place.
And, we don't have time to dive deep into those business cases today in this 30-minute presentation, But let's just talk a little bit about this idea of open by design, right? So you kind of talked a little bit about this at the beginning of your advice here, which was that maybe there is some policies or governance or papers that people aren't open sourcing. Oftentimes, I don't know about you, but I just have this opinion that when somebody starts with this idea that a thing is open by design, it's higher quality because they know that they're preparing to share it.
It's different when you know everybody's going to take a look at it, isn't it?
Yeah, so when you start with this at the outset, the building things in a way that has a common language that you can really level set with your community on, that you know that you're going to put out in front of additional eyes, you inherently make that more accessible, and by virtue of that, it's higher quality.
I agree. And I think as we look at the strategy and begin to include those pieces into our strategy, things begin to solid up. So if we look at the next slide, we see things like, well, how am I going to do this? Well, I need to consider things like my sunk cost. I need to understand what my people need to be trained on. So as we start looking at the actual physical things that go into that business case that help us define which open source project we're going to invest in as our enterprise. Now let's pretend that Andrew and I are in an enterprise together. I need to make sure that our enterprise contributes to this thing and makes a difference. We want to make it better, absolutely. I need to understand how it's going to make me better too. So as I don't know, as onerous as I suppose it is, we have to deal with the fact that it really is all about the money in some cases to an enterprise. We have to make sure that we understand where the money's going. And in this case, we're actually making kind of that cool moment where we've injected something into a community. We've helped that community get better. We've gone ahead and trained our people so that we are better, and things are good. The things we need to avoid, however, are things like a developer coming up and saying, hey, let's do this cool new thing. It's going to be really hard for you as the CISO to defend your choice to include Rust into your strategy this year if the best argument you have for it is it's cool. Or, hey, by the way, it fits in this framework. Totally cool that it fits in your framework, but as the business owner, I need to know what your business case is for it. And there are plenty of ways to do that. So make sure that you put the numbers to the problem.
Yeah, I think this is an area where open source can really help. Like if we just go back to the Rust example, like how many things, if you have a brand new startup company, can you take out of your sec pipeline because you're building on something like Rust, where Rust is built to be inherently safe from the ground up. The compiler literally just can't build things that aren't operationally safe from a memory perspective, from a type safety perspective. They make it very, very, very hard to pursue anti-patterns. And so
how quantifiable is I can prove to you it's safe? That's awesome.
Yes, provable with math. And that saves time, it saves money, and it makes your users safer, right? So this is like a great example of where open source is kind of coming in and being the hero. Because I don't know about you, I've never worked at a place that just said, boy, we just have so much money to spend on security stuff this year. We're just looking for ways to spend money.
And I guarantee you the CFO will look at you as the CISO if you come in with a business plan that includes those numbers and say, hey, by the way, we're going to save X amounts of millions this year because we've done open source the right way. That's a beautiful day.
Speaking of doing it the right way, there is some good prior work here. One of my former bosses actually did this study in 2018, Jeff Briner, on open source security solutions and how prominent they were in security, and if they were actually really solving problems. So he put out a little survey for Security B-Sides Portland, which is a great B-Sides, by the way. If you've never been to Security B-Sides Portland, happens every October. And the video is available here, but just to kind of run through the highlights, most people were actually using open source software in their security program. And I would even challenge the people that said that they weren't, that maybe they just didn't know that they're using an OSS product in their security program. Like, have you ever used Nmap? Or do you use a vulnerability scanner? Or do you use something like OS Query, which are all great projects that are at the heart of some commercial solutions? So two significant numbers from that survey really stood out to me, which is the 52% number and the 66% number, where at least 52% of people admitted openly that they were using open source in their security effort, which is totally great. Slightly over half of respondents. And like I said, I think that's probably skewed. a little bit low based on knowledge of underlying products. But 66% of those folks cited a lack of curation and good support as the most major barrier to adoption and usage. And this is the thing that's preventing us from getting to that ideal, wide open kind of future. So if curation and support are a challenge, let's take a peek at 3 projects that are doing an excellent job of community curation and also have a great product market fit. And of course, we're going to pick on cloud projects because that's kind of mine and Nathan's bread and butter.
And I think primarily we're going to, well, first anyway, we'll pick on Prowler. So Tony's a friend, I'll be very honest. Wonderful person, like to work with him. And Prowler is a great way for us to go ahead and evaluate environments to decide whether or not those environments are actually appropriate and where we expect them to be with some really nice baselines. Tony, myself, and a friend of ours actually wrote a really nice blog about this earlier this year. We walked through how to do it in AWS and actually even gave you some demonstration code as to how you need to get it done and how to even inject that into Security Hub if that's what you want to do, or frankly, to inject it into whatever SIEM you want to.
And this is a great example of the specialty library case, right? Because it's totally it's a purpose-built tool that really solves a problem. Like somebody saw a problem in the community and they just said, I'm going to solve that with automation and tooling that doesn't exist. And that is very cool. And then there's this project Scout Suite. Like tell us a bit more about Scout Suite. I think it's one of the older cloud auditing tools out there.
Yeah. Well, I can't say that I know a red team that doesn't use Scout Suite at some point in their red team review or their pen testing review. So, I mean, it's kind of one of those bread and butter items, again, that we will use for an audit or a review of an account that we frankly may not know anything about. So if Andrew paid me to come and pen test his stuff, I'm probably running Prowler, I'm probably running Scout Suite against it to evaluate how that whole system sits together and whether there's some basic stuff that needs to be corrected.
And then that brings us to one of my personal favorites, CloudMapper. So when I go out and I do an audit, I love to use this tool, CloudMapper, which came out of Duo Labs. And this is one of the cases where a corporation kind of is curating the project, right? But there's a huge community of people who are active maintainers kind of around this. And when I say huge, I generally mean greater than one, because it's very hard to find folks who are willing to step up and do this level of maintenance. But oftentimes, as a user of this tool, I receive better support than I receive for many commercial projects.
Well, weren't you telling me he responded to you in like 2 hours at one point?
Yeah, the support for the pull requests and GitHub issues is actually quite nice, merging issues. Just doing this generally good job of kind of engaging with the community and getting their feedback, I think, is one of the things that makes this tool really, really successful. Just in addition to this idea that it's kind of leaning into the idea that the only kind of auditing is continuous auditing, right? Yeah. This your environment's changing in the cloud at the speed of light, and you need something that's kind of always out there, always watching, looking for misconfigurations, which is a different talk in and of itself, but misconfigurations are a trend that continues to tick up over the last 2 or 3 years.
And I have to be honest, the fact that, I know he's kind of pivoted away from this, but the fact that it does give you that visual output, for my time, it was well worth being able to utilize it for some of that, where we would walk into an environment, not have any background on the environment, be able to kick this off and know, oh, I get it. So this connects to that. That's important.
Yeah, it's a very active project, very cool tool. Take a look at it if you have some time. But the point here with all 3 of these, right, is that they receive a lot of attention from their creators and the communities around them. They have excellent curation, and there is a incentive for the businesses in the case where there's a business involved to kind of support the work, and that helps make these 3 projects really successful. So we have a call to action for you, which is that we are trying to refresh that 2018 data with new 2020 data, which we hope will trend a certain way, or we have theories about the way it may trend, but we'd like to hear from you. So if you have time, please fill out the survey. Jeff Briner is going to refresh that data, and you'll have the ability, if you choose to, it's not a required question, you can opt into a mailing with the results, or a later webinar. We'll kind of do a readout and talk about the trends, whether they're up or down, and kind of make some predictions based on that.
Cool.
With that, we thank you. I'm Andrew, and this is Nathan, and that's our contact information there. You can follow me on Twitter. I'll tweet about the security survey, the white paper coming out, and you can follow up with us at those email addresses.
Thanks, everybody.